much, Irael, and I'm so happy to see many of you here that I recognize and know, and new people from the crowd. Yeah, so I do have this very intriguing title for this lecture. Shirela, can you share the screen, please? Which maybe it's a bit theatrical, really, to the lecture itself, but it is a case of research, and that's really more of, it's not really detective, curator, it's nothing hidden or like a secret, but it's a case of what happens behind the scene in the museum when you don't always work on an upcoming exhibition. In my position in the Tel Aviv Museum, so I do a lot of research on the collection itself. Next slide. And this is what happened when I was approaching a group of 23 works that we have by an artist named Chana Orloff. And Orloff, I knew a little bit about her, and basically I could recognize her sculptures, but the fact that in the museum we had quite a large group of works belonging to her was something substantial, something considerable, because usually our collection is made up one or two of works from the same artist, but a large group of work demands more research. And I knew that the last exhibition was done on Orloff many years ago, and I thought, okay, let's try and look into this work and how they arrived in the museum, to see if there's something new that I can tell about Chana Orloff. So before we move into the next slide, Shirel, I just wanted to show you that I just did two photos of my screen of the computer, and this is how the works of art appear in our computer system, collection system. And you can see each work, there's a photograph, and there's also a number. And since I know the museum collection and different things, also know to recognize that some of these numbers are very old numbers in our collection, and some of them are newer numbers. So I could also know that this collection did not arrive at one piece, okay? It arrived in different stages, probably by different donations. So this also made my research already interesting. Now we can move on to the next slide. Among the things that I did after I collected and made a list of works and made a list of their numbers and the different dates is to go to the files. Each work of art in the museum, in the registration office, has a file. And it's very important. We kind of think of it probably as something old-fashioned if we used to files online, and everything now is being computerized. But there are physical files, and in these files, there's anything that belongs or is in relation to the work of art. So it can be the shipping documents, it can be the first initial letters by the people who want to donate it. It can be newspaper clippings. It can be things that the artists themselves wrote about the piece of work of art. So this is the file of work number 97.58, and you can see the name of the artist is Chana Orloff, and the name of the work itself is The Dancer. And inside, if you can move on to the next slide, and inside, among other pieces of paper, I found this photograph. And it immediately amazed me, because there's something very comfortable by the fact of these people sitting, a black and white photo, sitting in somebody's living room. I could definitely recognize Chana Orloff on the right. I could see that they're dressed up, like just before they're going out for a dinner or to a party. I could see that it's a home setting. I could probably guess who, maybe who are the other artists? Are there other friends? And on the top left side, Shirel, you can probably mark it, I could see exactly. I could see the sculpture that we have in the museum. So if you start now, Shirel, clicking on the screen, you'll see that we have a few questions that I'm going to ask during my lecture, during my research. Who is Chana Orloff, first of all? Move on. What do I know about her? Yes, what is her background? Where did she come from? The next one is, what about her artworks? What do we know about her pieces of art, her legacy? Where are they now, and what collections among the world? The other questions that I want to ask are, who are these people in the photograph with her? What is their relationship between between them and Chana Orloff? And also I'd like to understand, what are the paintings on the walls? Do they belong to fellow artists? Do they still exist? Where are they? And last of all, I would like to try and place the time and location of this photograph. When was it taken and where was it taken? So I thought maybe through the furniture or through the, if I could recognize the place itself, the apartment itself, maybe I could know more about the photograph itself. So as you see, I had a lot of questions. And I started bit by bit to collect my information. So I guess the easiest part was to learn a bit more about Chana Orloff. And Orloff herself, as you see, she was probably in her mid-30s or 40s in this picture. She was born in Ukraine. You can move on another one. And she kind of had, in my imagination, had this big motherly figure. Yes, even here on this photograph, she's sitting on a stool, but she's actually like sitting as a position next to a statue that is next to her, looks very similar. And she has this very, maybe like a mother, a farmer mother, very strong figure to her. She was firstly born in Ukraine, as I said. She was number 7 between 8 children. Her mother was a midwife, her father was a teacher. But in 1905, her family left the Ukraine and they moved first to Petah Tikva. Next slide. And in Petah Tikva, her parents and her family tried to be farmers and tried to work the land. And it was not easy times for them. But Chana Orloff decided in 1910 to leave her family and to seek her own independent future. And she was very attracted to the arts, and she moved to Paris, okay, by herself. She didn't know anybody there. She moved to the place where things were happening in the beginning of the 19th century. But she didn't move as an artist. She first became a seamstress. And there was a lot of fashion houses in Paris, and she joined one of those. But in a short time, when she visited a friend who was a sculptor, she describes it in one of her letters that she would touch the material, the mold, and she felt this very strong sense of belonging, that she needs to be doing something with her hands, something much more physical. And then she started learning sculpture. And the photograph that you see here was taken a year after she arrived in Paris. And you can see, first of all, how she changed physically. She has this short, modern haircut, and she sent this home to her family, to Palestine, showing what she just did. And this is one of her first, it's not really a sculpture, it's more like a relief. And it's called Two Jews, which is so interesting that the subject of her art, from the beginning, she did not try and hide her identity, and it was not easy to be a Jew in the beginning of the 20th century in Paris, but she did not hide it, and she wanted to describe her fellow community, and you could see that these two people do have very maybe authentic looks, the man with the curly hair, the straight nose, the woman with the head covering. These are not European people, yes? They come somewhere from even the Middle East. So this is her beginning. This is where her journey starts. If we'll continue, we'll see that she really engages into this sculpture process. And this is something very important to understand. In the beginning of the century, when women decided to be artists and joined the artistic milieu, most of them, or even all of them that I can think of, became painters. It was much easier to become painting. There was an art school for ladies, young ladies in Paris to become painters. But to become a sculptor, especially working with stone and metal, it's much more of a physical process, and it was not very popular, even accepted, you know. The fact that she, as a young woman, as an immigrant, as a Jew, wanted to do something that was so different from what her fellow artists or female artists were doing really stands out as a unique feature in her. And we'll see how she continues this throughout her life, standing out alone as something that she, as an urge that she needs to do as her artistic calling, that she cannot change or think of something else. So this is like a short example of one of her early works. We can see how stylistic. She most of the time she does portraits of men and women, and you can see that although you could definitely identify the features of the hair, not yet, Shirel, of the, yes, move back, yes, another one. Okay, you're giving up all of my story. So, so at least you can see the features of the woman. On the other hand, she doesn't go into great detail. It's much more stylistic. And the fact here also is that she takes at the base of the sculpture, which usually we have a sculpture and we just put it on a pedestal, yes? And here she thinks of the sculpture itself as one, as one thing, as one unit, as both the sculpture and the base and the pedestal needs her attention. And she does it in a very different way, and you can see in a different kind of rough way to make a difference between the sculpture and the base. Now you can move on. No, yes, okay. So a bit about her personal life. In 1916, she met a young Polish poet, of course, also a Jew, and they connected together. His name was Ari Justman, and he was like also popular in the avant-garde circles as a poet, and they got married. Ari Justman was very friendly, the next slide, with Apollinaire, with Guillaume Apollinaire, which is more of a well-known poet at the time. So you could see to what milieu Chana Orloff was belonging to the avant-garde, to the young people. Most of them were also immigrants who came to Paris and to try and to create new things. They worked together. You can move on to the next slide. Orloff and Justman, they worked together and they cooperated on this magazine called SIC, Sound, Image, Color, where there were poems published, and you can see Orloff contributed with her sketches, and it was, and even if you can move on one more, you can see that there's woodcuts that she made and she printed on them. Now, if you notice beforehand, Ari Justman and Guillaume Apollinaire died in very similar dates. They actually died a few months from each other, 1818, and I'm sorry, you're right. Somebody just wrote on you're right, it's a wrong. Apollinaire died in 1918, okay? And Ari Justman died in 1919. Thank you for correcting me. So what happened is, of course, this is the end of the First World War, and both of them as immigrants they volunteered to the Red Cross, okay? And they caught, of course, the Spanish flu. And Guillaume Apollinaire died first, and a few months afterwards, Ari Justman died. And Orloff was left alone, and you can move on, with a young son. Their son was not even a year old, as a young widow. And this is from a little album that she printed, that she was invited to contribute to print. And you can see these are woodcuts that she printed, and you can see that they're very mellow and they're very black, and the way that she uses the wood, the grain of the wood, into her own images. The woman on the left is not exactly her, but it is an image of a widow, which she felt she was part of that now. And you can see now, if you can move on, there's a quote. She wrote about herself: "I have accumulated a number of disabilities. In the beginning, yes, she was a foreigner, she was a Jew, a woman, and now she was a widow and a mother." So at a very young age, she had to take upon herself a lot, especially as a young mother. And we can see, you can move on to the next slide, that she did not stop, but she just embraced herself in work, and with people inviting her to contribute to different things. And she had a lot of people that surrounding her that helped her and asked for her work. So one of these projects is the Figures of Today. And you can see that, if you probably recognize, there's Picasso and Kiesling, and she did a few more portraits. There were 41 portraits in this little booklet. There was Goncharova, Diego Rivera, a few other artists and cultural people. She used graphite to draw their portraits. So this is one of her pieces of work that she did during that time when she was recovering from the loss of her husband. And you can move on. Okay, so that was like a little bit a dive into Chana Orloff's biography. I know, and to a certain extent, to a certain point, throughout the lecture, I'm going to continue and tell you a bit more about what happened to Orloff during the war, during the Second World War, and also in her later years. But as for now, you can move on a few more, so we know a bit more about Orloff. And now I want to talk a little about her artistic legacy and about her sculptures. So you can move on to the next slide. And just to tell you a little bit about how did this sculpture arrive, right? So I said that we have 23 works of Chana Orloff, and they came in different periods of time. So the sculpture that you see on the left, The Dancer, was part of a large donation of modern sculpture that we received in 1997 by the Woloch family, Woloch collection. And you can see in the background, there are sculptures by Giacometti on the back left. Can you see? No, that's not Giacometti. Yes, those are Giacometti. And there's in the middle, there's a woman reclining. That's a Degas. And the two pieces in the front, those are Archipenko's. So we received this large body of works by a wealthy family who really collected modern sculpture. About this specific sculpture, and you can move on to the next slide, please. So The Dancer, it's such a beautiful sculpture that has a lot of movement to it. So if we look at it, we can see that, of course, it's made out of wood, and it's very polished wood, so it's even a bit shiny. But she plays on the movement in two different ways. First of all, you can see on the base of the skull, the woman is standing on her tippy toes, right? And the legs are crossed. And then her hands on the top are crossed to the other direction. So there's some sort of rotation happening within the figure itself. And also there's something narrow, wide in her hips, and then narrow again, and then wide again, and then narrow again in her head. So there's some movement happening also to the length and also to the width of the sculpture. And in the form itself, you can see it begins pretty as a base, pretty thick and firm. It stands steady, and then it goes narrow again on the tippy toes, and then again on the waist, and then again on the head. It's mostly smooth, but there are a few details in her hair. We can see a few lines, and also in the hands that she's holding up to her face. And this is such a unique sculpture, such a pretty sculpture that it is on the cover of the catalog of this collection. If you move another one, you'll see that just for a comparison, I also bought another work by Degas of a dancer. And you can see such different styles. Of course, Degas was earlier than Orloff, and she probably knew his work very well if she was living in Paris, but just different ways to represent a dancer in movement. Yes, okay, so now we're going to go through a few more of Orloff's work. Most of them are from our collection, and that's why you'll see there's numbers on the top, on the bottom. That's just how we catalog them. And I felt like it's fine to leave it because you'll be part of my research in the museum. So you can see she uses different kind of wood and materials. Most of her sculptures are of people that she knew, and she was, you know, how do you say, she was paid for to make their sculptures. So this is a sculpture of a young girl. And again, it's very round, very soft, very stylized, with a few details in the skirt, the pleats in the skirt, and of course the face. Next sculpture. This is a sculpture of commissions. Thank you very much, Judith. Yes, so this is a sculpture of Mrs. Harari, and you can see here she's using bronze, and there's a bit more detail, so we can see the folds of her skirt. We can see the dress, also her hair and her face. And there's something very, maybe long and narrow in this sculpture. Probably this woman was also very slender and tall, and she took it into her sculpture, into the figure of the sculpture. This sculpture was made in 1925. And the interesting thing that I found, if you look in the next slide, this sculpture of a kneeling woman was also made in the same year. And it amazed me that in the same year she should create something so narrow, so thin, in such a different style, than this very round and soft woman, kneeling woman. So I could really see her ability to go from one style to another according to what she wants to express, according to her feelings. So maybe Mrs. Harari was something more, you know, maybe a bit more strict about her. I think she was also a teacher, so maybe that's connected. And as opposed to this woman who's very round, very feminine, in a very in a kneeling position. If we move on to the next slide, I also found, no, you skipped one. I also found in our collection a few drawings of Orloff, which are also beautiful to see because she always had a bit of, she had such a nice way of drawing and catching her models before she turned them into sculpture. And this was interesting to see, very similar, a woman reclining or kneeling as opposed to the sculpture that we just saw beforehand. And next slide. Another one of her themes is mother and child, which I think is also something a bit more courageous of Orloff, because as a woman, she didn't necessarily have to address this topic. You know, a lot of women who were artists at the time did not want to stress or show too much about the fact of them being mothers. As you know, beforehand she said it was kind of a disability. Yes, but Orloff didn't shy away from it, and she has quite a few sculptures dedicated to motherhood. Well, you know, you could also think of it as a classic theme, a Madonna and a child, of course, but also she had more sculptures dedicated to her own son. If you move on, you can see a beautiful picture of Orloff and her son. He's probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old. His name is Didi. And the sculpture on the side is very similar to the sculpture that we saw beforehand. This one is made out of stone, and the one that we saw beforehand was bronze, but that's part of the procedure of sculpture. And also, if you see on the top right, that's a portrait of her son, of Didi. So, and if you move on to the next slide, you'll see that also in the museum, we have a work, one of her sculptures that is called My Son, 1924. So that's more or less maybe a bit later than the picture was taken. And you can see here again, she is using the Cubist language, because you can see that she took out of the stone, she took out a very geometrical forms, and she really shaped them, she smoothed them down. But on the other hand, it's very, you can still really recognize the person or the child that's behind this sculpture itself. There is something, one second, there is something a bit strange about this sculpture, in my opinion, is that she decided to leave the eyes hollow. I haven't seen this in any of her other sculptures, but the fact that she did not want to really give, I don't know, I feel like a life, something to wake up this sculpture. She left it hollow. It's interesting to maybe understand that a bit more. We can move on. Another one of her sculptures is of a Jewish painter. Again, a subject that many of the other, her contemporary fellow artists didn't really relate to Jewish themes, but she didn't shy away. And we don't know exactly what sculpture which Jewish painter it is. There are a few that she was hanging out with us. We'll talk about it in a moment. But you can see again, she's using long shapes, long faces, long fingers, taking them out of the clay itself. Okay, we'll move on now. Now, I couldn't talk about sculpture in the beginning of the century in Paris without recognizing what was around her. Because I'm sure, even though it's not written in any place specific, but I'm sure she knew about Brancusi, and she knew about other sculptures that were happening in the same time as she was working in Paris. So of course, Brancusi, he's a Romanian artist. He started off in Romania, and he came to Paris in 1905. So they were there together at the same time. So there were, again, a lot of immigrants at the time in Paris. And they were all hanging out more or less in the same Monopress, in Lachette, like in the same areas. Now, what's special about Brancusi, you can move on to the next one, just a short example of his sculptures, is that Brancusi really sought to find the essence of his subjects. And this is quite an early sculpture. We can see it's not yet totally, he goes much more into abstract forms. There are still features of eyes and hairs and hands, but he is looking for something in the movement, something in the twist, and he really tries to find the essence of that person. If you move on, just to give you a small example, which I found a little bit similar to what Orloff was doing, there's something about the movement in the hands in Brancusi's sculpture that is similar to the hand holding the fan in Orloff's sculpture, and the little details that she gives in the fan and in the hand. We can move on just to think a little bit more about Brancusi's legacy, that he says that the artist should know how to dig out the being that is within the matter, okay? And that he was searching for in his own artistic way, and an own artistic way, where he slowly left all the details and tried to really find the being that he talks about. Another example, we can move on, is of course Brancusi's Bird in Space, which I think is really one of the masterpieces of modern art, how from a very a thin line with a very details, paid attention to very small details, really you receive a movement or the essence of what this bird is about. And it's interesting to see, if you move on, that Orloff also addressed this topic of a bird in movement, a bird in flight, but you can, later on in her career, this is from a monument in Kibbutz Bet Oren in 1964, but you can see Orloff did it in a very different way. I think this one is much more grounded. The bird is not flying out so much, but there is something from very similar, I feel, between these two birds. Another short mentioning is a sculpture named Alexander Archipenko, also a Jewish sculptor. He came from Ukraine, so he was, a fellow neighbor of Orloff, and he was more of a, and he was working in Paris at the same time, and you can see his sculptures also dealt with the female figure, only with the female figure, more in a cubist style. He used very geometrical forms, and he was looking really for what also can happen with a negative space. So where does the eye complete the form? Yes, exactly there. And also, yeah, when you take out the matter, when you take out the form itself and you're left with the space and light and air around the sculpture, how do you see that? And in the different curves and feeling in the sculpture itself. So that's a little bit about Chana Orloff's artistic career, her different sculptures, her style, and also about the different sculptors that were working at the same time as Orloff in Paris. So now I was interested, what about these people? I had quite of a firm guess about who the male figure is. And maybe in the chat you could throw in who you think it is, because you probably recognize him. But it was a bit interested to see who this woman was. Because on the one hand, they were, no, not Picasso, but a friend of Picasso and a friend of Orloff. The man sitting in the center with a little bit of a shy kind of smile. He's handing out his hand. His hand is, he's tipping his cigarette. He's got his other hand in the pocket. His feet are close by to each other. That is Chaim Soutine, of course, the Jewish painter. Chaim Soutine, the Russian Jewish painter, and he and Orloff were very friendly. So I knew about Soutine, and I was trying to figure out who this woman was. So let's first start about Soutine. If you move on to the next slide. Okay, so Chaim Soutine, I'm sure many of you know, because he is one of the more famous figures of what we are calling now the School of Paris, or the Jewish School of Paris. He was a young man who arrived from Minsk, from Russia. He's number 10 of 11 children, came from an Orthodox family. His parents were not very interested in his artistic career, and he left at a very young age. He came to Paris without knowing anybody, without knowing the language, and he came with other Jewish artists. And gradually, without much money, without much knowledge, he just started painting, and he was recognized by his very emotional and very bright brushstrokes that we all know about his paintings. There's a quote here. If you move on 1 second, you'll see how Chana Orloff describes Soutine. And she says, usually Soutine was a man of integrity, collected within himself, and only rarely would he talk about himself, about his life. Although Soutine did not make a special impression with his appearance, there was something special about him. He knew how to behave in society and did not despise the accepted manners. He was shy by nature, modest, but you could immediately feel that with all of his simplicity, this man knows his worth, okay? So Sutin was very friendly with Orloff. I think he felt that she was kind of a mother figure for him. And also Sutin was not a very healthy man. He had problems with digestion, with his ulcer, and he needed support. The painting that you see on the right, the painting in the middle, that's a self-portrait of Sutin. And the painting that you see on the right, let's see who can guess. Who is that painting by? It's somebody painted Sutin. And that painting is by another friend, another member of the School of Paris, and that's, of course, Amedeo Modigliani. So if you move on to the next slide, Amedeo Modigliani came to Paris around that same time. He was of Italian origin, Jewish Italian, of course. He was quite a figure among those neighborhoods in Paris. He did not have much money, and he tended to like to drink, and he used to walk into bars and coffee shops and say, whoever would give me a drink, I'll give him a painting. But slowly, Amedeo Modigliani and Chaim Sutin met with a dealer called Leopold Zborowski, and he helped them establish themselves as painters and sell their works. So Amedeo Modigliani was also friendly with Chana Orloff, and we know this from her own memories, but also from a very interesting piece of paper that was found. If you move on to the next piece, you can see there's a small drawing that Modigliani drew on an envelope, probably in some coffee shop somewhere in Paris. And you can see that's a portrait of Orloff in a very Modigliani style way. A long nose, her eyes are very small. And on the top, you could see it's written in Hebrew, Chana bat Raphael. Modigliani asked Chana Orloff how to write her name, and it was important for him to write it in Hebrew. And we know that many times in his paintings, in his works, Modigliani writes the names of his sitters, the people who appear in the paintings. And this is like a gesture that he does to Orloff and to their Jewish identity and heritage. And Amedeo Modigliani, even though his subjects in his paintings did not touch upon his Jewish heritage, he did not shy away from it. And he used to say, my name is Amedeo Modigliani and I am a Jew. So he had it up front, but in his drawings, it seldomly appears. Orloff, supposedly, if you move on to the next one, was also the one who introduced Amedeo Modigliani to the love of his life, Jeanne Habitro, and you can see these beautiful paintings that Amedeo Modigliani painted of her. And we know that she was very young at the time. They had a little girl, and Modigliani died suddenly very young from Shachefet. Shachefet is, Shirel, help me out.
I think it's tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis, thank you very much. And the fact that he liked to drink did not help his disease, and he died. And she committed suicide the day after she heard that he died, and she was 9 months pregnant. So we know that tragedy, which is very very well known in the stories about the Jews of Paris, the artists of Paris. But it's interesting to see that in her memories, Chana Orloff describes the funeral day of Jeanne Habitro, and she was close to the couple. She knew them very well. If we move on, I'd like to mention also another sculptor, somebody that at the time was close to Modigliani and to Sutin, and that is Jacques Lipschitz. He was also a sculptor, and he was the one who actually connected them with Leopold Zborowski, with the dealer. So you can see on the left is a sample of one of his Cubist style, very Cubist style sculptures. And on the right, that is a portrait that Modigliani painted of the Lipschitz couple. If we move on, there's another, within this research, I discovered another painting by a not so well-known artist at the same time of the School of Paris. His name is Jacob Billit, and he paints here a portrait of 4 young men who were artists at the time, and you can see one of them was Henry Epstein. The one on the second to the left is Sutin. We can recognize him now, right? With those very thick lips and dark eyes. And then the one in the middle is Pinchas Kremiesh and the Japanese painter Aishi. So just on the side note, that within this research, I also discovered new things about paintings that we have in our collection, that have been in the museum collection, that have not been, they did not receive a lot of attention until now. Okay, so now we're going to move on and talk about the lady in the picture that we have not yet recognized. Who could she be? In the beginning, I had an assumption, maybe this was the caregiver, the caretaker of Sutin, because she is facing Sutin, and there seems to be some sort of intimacy between them. And I knew that Sutin was a very sick man. And during the war, he had a young woman named Greta Michaelis come from Russia, and she was a nurse, and they had some sort of intimate relationship between them. But looking again at the picture, this was strange because it didn't look like this picture was taken at the time of the war. They look too relaxed, they're dressed too well, and something didn't register with it. So I tried again to write to the Chana Orloff atelier in Paris. I contacted them in the beginning of my research. I did not receive an answer. And I also contacted the Chaim Sutin Foundation, and they were surprised to hear about this photo. They did not know about it. And then I said, okay, I have to receive more information. I tried contacting again the atelier in Paris. And then I received an answer. And if you move on, Shirel, another bit, I was told by the granddaughter of Orloff, who today is in charge of the atelier, that this woman is Olga Shacharov, and she was a painter, a Russian painter at the same time in Paris. And she had her own artistic career, and she was very friendly with Orloff and the whole milieu. And probably also her husband is the one who takes the photograph, okay? Because we always have to remember when we see a photograph, the people on the photograph exist, but also whoever took the photograph itself is present at the same time in the room. And she was married to a photographer. If you move on, you can see there's a later on photograph that I found. Again, we see Sutin and we see Orloff, and we see in the middle is probably Olga. And then the man next to her is probably her husband, Otto Lloyd, who put the photograph on a timer and then ran behind the scene and joined them to be in the photo itself. So I was really happy to understand who this woman is, and also to receive the information about the photographer and more about the people who were in the photograph. In this photograph, you can probably recognize the young boy sitting next to Orloff is her son, is Didi, probably at the age of 12 or 13, it looks to me. And you can see that between his legs, he has a wooden cane, because Didi contracted polio as a young boy, and till the rest of his life, he suffered from remnants of that disease. So this is a beautiful photograph. So, okay, so I really felt I was I was starting to find answers in this, about this photo, but I had a few more open questions. And one of them, if you move on, was about the paintings on the wall. So most of them I couldn't recognize, but that painting specifically really intrigued me. Who could that be? Who painted that work? And because Chana Orloff was an artist herself, probably the paintings on the wall belonged to people she knew, fellow artists, to her colleagues, people she appreciated. Now, I didn't recognize the painting. I said, it could have been so many different painters. I just didn't know where to start with. So if you move on, I went back to one of my sources, and this is a biography or memoir that Dr. Chaim Gamzu, who at the time was the director of the Tel Aviv Museum, wrote memoirs of Chana Orloff. He sat down with her in 1966, and he wrote her memoirs. One of the people, in her memoirs, she mentions Soutine, she mentions Modigliani, she tells about herself, how she arrived in Paris. And one of them, she also mentions an artist named Georges Carl, which, you know, I didn't know about, I didn't really recognize beforehand. I straight away Googled him, and I thought, okay, this looks interesting. This is somebody that I did not know about, but he has paintings, and he was a creator in the same time. So I continued my research, and if you move on, I found that if I Googled his name in Paris museums, I could see one of his paintings that was in the Pompidou collection. And this painting, a woman with a gray shawl, painted in 1930, if we move on, you'll see, is exactly the same painting that Orloff had on her wall. It looks a bit like a talit, but I don't think it is. Okay, so probably the painting that Orloff had on the wall was one of the primary, you know, preparatory paintings that the artist did before he completed the full figure. And since Orloff and him were close, she had it on her wall. So I thought that was fascinating. And then I moved on, and I said, I'll research this painter a bit more. And I found that he had two works in the museum's collection, and they're beautiful paintings. One of them was Pharaoh's Daughter, and the other one was Woman Sitting on a Chair. Two beautiful, large works that are in the museum's collection that did not really appreciate or being recognized much before. I don't know if they were ever exhibited. And I felt like, wow, what a discovery. The interesting part, and if you move on, is to understand that it's also a bit of a tragedy, because in 1942, during the occupation in Paris, Orloff was obliged to flee Paris, and she through Grenoble and then Lyon, she arrived in Switzerland, and she spent the war years in Switzerland. And also she did this journey with Georges Carl. And in her memoirs, she describes the way she really has a young man with her son, Didi, who is invalid. He cannot walk very well. And she's trying to cross the border together with Georges Carl, who is also a very dependent kind of nervous person, and she has to drag them along, cross the river, and persuade the guards in the Swiss border to let them in, that they need a place to run away to. The thing is that in the end of the war, 1945, and they both spent time in Switzerland, she went back to Geneva to visit Georges Carl, and they were planning to head back to Paris together after the liberation. But Georges Carl understood the tragedy and how much of his family was lost during the war, during the Holocaust, that he committed suicide in the hotel in Switzerland, in Geneva. And at the same time, Orloff and her son were at the hotel. So this was a very strong bond between them. And this is a bit more about one of her sculptures that she did when she returned back to Paris after the war. And it's a sculpture that we can see is very different from her very smooth style. It's much more rough. And it took a long time until she agreed to exhibit this sculpture. Okay, we're going to move on because we are, okay, we're getting close. Okay, these are other sketches that I found in the museum collection, also with the same topic, the return. And we can see that this man is very thin, very, his eyes are very large and well into his thoughts. And it was kind of a state of being after the war that she had to get herself together. She went back to her studio. Much of her work, much of her sculptures were destroyed, but she, again, after this tragedy, she went back into work in full force. We'll move on. And now really the last question that I left open was, when was this taken and where? Okay, so I could think that it was probably taken in the beginning of the 1930s. That's what it felt to me. And then I was like, but where? Where was she living? So I went back to the website of the atelier of Orloff's studio in Paris, and we can move on. There's a bit of a description about how the workshop is and where all the sculptures were. And you can see for yourself that there was a large exhibit area in the beginning. But then if I read a bit more, that she had in her studio and an apartment that was built by an architect named Auguste Perret in 1926. And it was a well-known architect who really took time and details into the facade of the building. You can see it's made out of cement, glass, and wood to let a lot of light out into the studio itself. And the top two windows were her living quarters. So she lived above her studio. We can move on. We can see there's a few drawings of the studio itself. We're not going to go into it because, yeah, there's a lot of details. But in the website itself, there was a short video of in French describing the studio and describing the architecture of the studio. But if you pay attention, what do you recognize in this clip from the video? Is there something from the photo that you can see? Correct, the table. Okay, so this table that we saw in the photograph that was probably taken before the war, yes, before she fled to Switzerland, the two-layered table, the wooden table that was in the center of the photograph still remained. It's still there until today. And if you move on, Shirel, in another part of the video, I also saw the clips, of course. The painting of Georges Carls is still there, is still part of the collection. And I couldn't go into more details, even though the painting next to it also looked kind of familiar from the photograph. But it was fascinating for me to see that some of the things that I found in that photograph that was taken, you know, nearly 100 years ago by now, 19 years ago, are still part of Orloff's legacy in her atelier museum in Paris. And just to sum up, just to close up, if you move on, let's just understand a bit what happened to Orloff and also her connection to the museum. So the picture here you see is from the first building of the museum, which was where the house of Mayor Dizengoff's house on Sderot Dizengoff, today where at the time the Declaration of Independence was declared in 1948, but that was the first house of the museum. And you can see on the left is the sculpture of the young lady that we saw. And Orloff was a major figure in the establishment of the Tel Aviv Museum, because when Dizengoff in the beginning of 1932 wanted to have a museum in Tel Aviv, he didn't know much about art, but they told him, oh, there's a Jewish artist in Paris and she's quite successful. You should meet up with her. And Orloff was the one who introduced Dizengoff to Chagall, to Marc Chagall, who was another very important figure who promoted the museum. If you move on, there's a picture of Orloff in her apartment in Tel Aviv. Eventually, Orloff was quite successful in her career, throughout her career. Even in the beginning, in her first steps in 1913, 1915, she participated in the Autumn Salon, or the Salon of the Independents in Paris, among fellow artists that are well known, and her work was pretty much accepted. And also after the war, she managed to reestablish herself, and she maintained a very close connection to Tel Aviv and to the artistic community in Israel. So she bought an apartment in Tel Aviv, and she did quite a few commissioned work, mainly of them monuments to different places, kibbutzim and places around Israel, and you can probably see them when your next visit. But if you move on, in 1968, she was invited to the Tel Aviv Museum to do a retrospective exhibition, and you can both recognize these sculptures that are on the catalog itself, but unfortunately she died a few months beforehand in Tel Aviv. So she died in 1968 in Tel Aviv. She's buried in Tel Aviv, and her works are among many of the museum's collection in Israel and around the world. So if we go back so if we try and sum it up, this picture, although did not result in, in a large scale exhibition, and those are usually things that we come to museums and we see exhibitions, that's what we think is part of the museum work. But a lot of the museum work is behind the scenes, is the research, is finding out the different details, is trying to tell the stories. And really, I felt that this picture gave me the opportunity not only to learn about Orloff and about her artistic legacy, but through it, I got to discover more artists that I did not know. I got to discover a whole period of time in Paris among Jewish artists, and to see her personal point of view of things that happened there. And I got to tell, in my opinion, a beautiful story about one of the major female artists that still, I think, requires more attention and more recognition today. So I hope you enjoyed it. I'm here around now for a few more minutes for a few more questions.
Thanks, Sophia. Amazing story, and definitely I'd say under-recognized. One question is, what happened to her son? Like, does she have any living relatives now in Tel Aviv? You mentioned her daughter in the atelier in Paris.
Yes, so it's her granddaughter in the atelier in Paris. Okay, her son got married. I think he had 2 children, and one of them is in charge of the foundation in Paris. Now, it is an interesting question, where's the rest of her family? Because her family came to Palestine in 1910, and she probably has more relatives today in Israel. I do not know of them, and they have not been in touch with the museum or anything else, so I do not know.
So we have, we're over time, so we'll just take one question, and I see that Faith
if people want to hang on, it's fine by me. Yes.
So Faith, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Do you want to write down? Yes, I'm okay now. Hi, Sophia. It's Faith. I'm just curious, why have we never heard of Chana Orloff? I mean, of all the artists we've studied, and there's a lady in our shul who does, retrospectives on all these Jewish artists, and she's never mentioned Orloff. Why is she just suddenly coming to light?
Well, she's not suddenly coming to life. She's been around, and she's always had some sort of recognition. But I think that, as you saw her sculptures, she's very realistic, yes? She's very, in some way, she stuck to portraiture. And it wasn't necessarily so fashionable, in the late 1950s, 60s. and her story was not really told. She is pretty well known, but she's not in the front row. And things are happening now. I think especially women artists are getting more recognition. And you saw her works are definitely worth it, right? She's definitely worth it. And she's going to get her time, but it just takes somebody, a place, it takes a story, it takes a movie. Today it takes so much other things than just the work itself.
So we need to end.
Okay.
Thank you very much, because it was fascinating and amazing. And I'm thinking that maybe we need to talk about the School of Paris and its relationship to Judaism and the Jewish community. I think that would be one to dive into. And thank you for taking us on this journey. It's going to be
my pleasure. I'd like to wish you all Chag Urim Sameach, and I hope we have many more opportunities to learn about artists and to talk about art, and to learn together and to get inspiration from these amazing people. Shirel probably will send out a few notes, right?
Yes, it's going to be a fun follow-up email to construct.
Yes.
I'm waiting to work
also,
on
I
it.
just would like to share that Shirel will also put it in the notes, but I created a post about this story in the Compost magazine, which is in Hebrew, but it's very interactive. The magazine of the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. So that will also be in our...
I'll send the link, and I'll also try and write a few words about it in English, because I think it's another fascinating feature of the museum, and not many people know about it. I mean, I think the artistic community in Tel Aviv absolutely does, but kind of it will allow you a glimpse of something that is kind of a hidden gem. So it's going to be... Thank you so much, everyone. Almost Shabbat Shalom here.
Almost Shabbat
Shalom. Thursday night. So Friday is upon us. So I get to say Shabbat Shalom.
Shirel, can you hang on for a second?
Okay, bye, everyone.